In India's capital city, Delhi, where I am this evening, there is an air emergency. But guess what? We have mutely just decided to live with this. As historian and author Ram Guha has said, even if there was no climate change, India would be an environment disaster zone. Ram Guha's new book, Speaking with Nature, looks at the history of India's homegrown environment movement and not just takes us back into time to talk about 10 individuals who had the foresight to anticipate many of the environmental challenges and disasters we are today confronted with, but also makes the point that a blind imitation of what the West calls development was never the prescription for a country like ours. Yet the tragedy remains. There isn't a single political party that is willing or able to mainstream issues related to the environment. And we, the people, must also ask ourselves why we are so passive when it comes to these issues. Joining us now is author historian Ramachandra Guha, one of India's foremost historians and political analysts, but here in his capacity as the author of a new book, the recently published Speaking with Nature, that, as I said, is a chronicle of 10 different individuals who had the foresight really to anticipate many of the crises, Ram, that we are today confronted with. It's a fascinating book from Rabindranath Tagore to Miraben. It captures a varied set of individuals, all united by a kind of very tactile, bottom-up understanding of what environmentalism really means. And what really comes through your book is that India's environmental movement predated the Western notion of an environmental movement. And in India today, today's generation may look at climate change, the debates around environment, as something that is a first world luxury. But what you're really saying in our book is that India has historically always grappled with these conversations, even well before the Chipko movement.
Yes, Barkha, thank you for having me on the show. So, my own journey as an environmental scholar dates to the 80s when I did a doctoral dissertation on the Chipko movement. And this book goes much further back into the 19th century with the onset of large-scale industrialization and urbanization. So when the British colonized India, of course, there was large-scale environmental devastation, particularly the rapacious exhaustion of forests. But then when the first cities, when the first colonial cities came, the first factories, textile and so on, you had chimneys, and not just British capitalists, but Indian capitalists. And watching this were people like Rabindranath Tagore, who saw his hometown Kolkata transformed in the second half of the 19th century into this bustling industrial metropolis, generating wealth, employment, energy, but also noxious fumes, polluting the air, polluting the waters, leaving all this debris behind. And people like him started wondering whether we needed to blindly emulate Western models of industrial and urban development. Not to say that Tagore glorified in poverty, like not in Gandhi or not in many of the other people in this book, but they were really anticipating a time when, given our high population densities, our fragile ecologies, the fact that India did not have colonies, unlike the West, we would have to, as you say, generate a bottom-up perspective to development that would combine environmental sustainability with community organization and social justice. So these three things, decentralized political governance, respect for nature and natural limits, and social justice. Because, Barkha, one last point, since you mentioned Delhi air pollution, or North India air pollution, wrongly misclassified as Delhi's air pollution, it's in all northern cities. In this air pollution, which is there in the winter months, it is the poor and the vulnerable who suffer most because, middle class and upper class Indians have air purifiers and so on. So the social justice aspect of the environmental movement often gets lost because people think it's only about gorgeous landscapes, forests, rivers, tigers, elephants, exotic bird species. Not at all. It's about integrating environmental sustainability with everyday life.
So here's the paradox before we come to some of the specific stories from your book. The paradox is this. As you said, India has historically, or Indians have historically, the great thinkers of our time or before our time have historically wedded social justice with the idea of environmentalism. The poor are the worst hit. Why is this not an electoral issue? Why do we not have our own version of the Green Party? Why are people not on the streets about this issue?
I'll come to the electoral issue in a minute, but I think it's important to recognize that the thinkers in this book people like Tagore, people like Mira Ben, you mentioned, people, agricultural scientists like Gabriel and Albert Howard, town planners like Patrick Geddes, the people who are there in my book were dissenters. They were going against the grain. Because most Indian thinkers, whether it be Nehru or Subhash Bose or the great engineer from my home state of Karnataka, M. Visvesvaraya, believed that India had been colonized because we were not industrialized enough, that we had to adopt centralized methods of production when we became independent, lose a lot of capital, a lot of energy, large conglomerations, steel mills, big dams, big large cities, and that's when we would be proudly independent. But these thinkers were dissenters even in their own time. Now, of course, we are confronted with a huge environmental and social crisis. You're absolutely right. The fact that even Parliament is debating. Now, there are two things I'd like to say. That this hostility or indifference to environmental sustainability, whether it be forests, water, housing, energy, soil, whatever, the health of our soil, is agnostic across political parties. The UPA was little better than the NDP. And state governments, whether it be the DMK or the left or whatever, they see environmentalists as an obstacle to development, as busybodies, as somehow coming in the way of India becoming great and glorious and rich and prosperous. Sometimes, of course, their material interests, that large projects which are promoted by mining barons and contractors. Also, they're the same people who fund political parties. So you can understand why chief ministers and prime ministers don't want hard questions asked. But it's not an electoral issue, for two reasons. One is, of course, the media, the mainstream media particularly, has become very hostile to environmental questioning, except at times of crisis like when the AQI reaches 400 or 500. But I think our first past the post system means, there are many issues in India. There is, caste discrimination, gender discrimination, employment, income, and so on and so forth. And this is one among a bouquet of important issues. Now, you can't, if you had a system of proportional representation, like in Germany, a Green Party could get 7-8% of the vote, be in parliament, articulate its concerns, see some of those ideas enacted into policy, and even, as has happened in places across Europe, sometimes they even are part of governments. Just as today you may have, the argument would be that coalition governments are good for India because they represent regional diversity. Not just one majority. So if we did in the first past the post system, it's very hard to get environmental concerns articulated in mainstream politics. Also, in a centralized system, if we had proper decentralization, if the 73rd and 74th amendments to the Constitution were really given teeth, where a local village community or local city could decide how to use its natural resources, how to manage its forests, how to manage its water, you'd find much wiser and more responsible policies.
Absolutely. And then, when we go to the individual thinkers, there's some extraordinary stories here, including when Mira Ben, a British woman till she becomes actually a freedom fighter, challenges Nehru. Today, Nehru would be considered, a left-wing thinker. But for Mira Ben, he's constructed a questionable development model, the Big Dam model.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, economists, mainstream economists, whether left-wing or right-wing, whether they're free market or welfarist, don't understand the environmental predicament. I will happily take names, but India has produced many famous economists, including Nobel laureates and so on, and professors in prestigious American universities. Regardless of whether left-wing, centrist, or free market, they are utterly ignorant of the cost to human life, livelihood, employment that environmental devastation causes. Which is true also of most of our columnists, particularly our business columnists in the mainstream press. So I think one of the characters in my book, Mira Ben, you mentioned, was a Gandhian economist called J.C. Kumarappa, who also challenged Nehru and promoted decentralized bottom-up development, the use of renewable energy, the revival of common property resources that sustain agriculture and pastoralism. And it's really that kind of bottom-up environmentalism that these thinkers articulated intellectually, which Chipko many decades later articulated kind of instinctively and through social protest. When the men and women and children of Garhwal and Kumaon said, the forests are for us, not for paper and plywood factories from far away. Now, so I think how to revive that? Now, we have climate change, which I think has woken up at least young people. So young people, you are one generation younger than me, almost a generation younger than me. Then you have several generations younger than you who are there. I'm in my 60s.
Yeah.
There are people in their 20s and so on who are actually much more environmentally conscious. But how do they find an outlet for social mobilization, for consciousness raising, for changing the attitude of power holders? That is the next
Yeah.
question, important question that the Indian environmental movement will face today.
And the other really interesting story from your book was, let's say, Indore is an example of a city that, as you write, could become way more attractive than Mumbai or Delhi. I think it
Yes.
already is. Indore routinely gets voted or selected as one of the cleanest
Yes.
cities in India, one of the best developed cities. And there's a story behind the Indore model that goes right back to the Holkars. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I've not been to India in recent times, but one of the characters in this book is Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish town planner who worked in India, and the British colonial system did not like him. So he sought
Yeah.
refuge in the princely states, and he wrote plans for several princely states, and above all Holkar, where his model was the garden city. So a city that generates employment, that has factories, that has offices, but that is in harmony with its natural environment where the rivers are clean. I don't think the indoor rivers are that clean. Indore is very good at recycling and sewage
Yeah.
management. But
Yeah.
also where you have parks for women and children, where you plant indigenous species. And he believed that he himself was a native of Edinburgh in Scotland, which is much
Mhm.
smaller than London. And he had been a professor at Dundee, which is even smaller than Edinburgh. So he saw the real possibilities for creative urban living lay in smaller towns and cities. Geddes, among other things, coined the term megalopolis. A city gone
Mm.
crazy and bursting at the seams,
Mm.
which is Bangalore now. Now, what if what if
Mm.
uh, other loads of other cities like Mysore, Dharwad, in Karnataka, what to develop and where uh, younger people would not have to migrate to the large city for employment. It would also lead to, of course, a more meaningful social life and a much less of a stress on natural resources. Like Bangalore today, it gets its water from the Kaveri, which is 60, 70 miles away. It's pumped up a plateau of 2,000 feet. Now there's talk
Mm.
as Bangalore grows more and more and there are water shortages and people depend on tankers that we'll have to go to the Sharavati, which is in the Western Ghats, several hundred miles away. Now, what if you have decentralized urban development? I think that's in some ways that is how we should be thinking. I mean, I
And because the crisis of our cities is also the migration. Again, I'm not anti-migration. Everybody has a right to come to the city to seek livelihood. But the crisis of our cities is ironically that we have not created enough incentive for people to stay where they are.
absolutely, and one of the actually, if you look at beyond environment, if you look at
Yeah.
balanced regional development, if you contrast, because I live in Karnataka, and if I contrast Karnataka with two neighboring states, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Karnataka is all about Bangalore. Bangalore generates the money, the revenue. Bangalore is the city of hope,
Mm.
opportunity for all Kannadigas and for people all over India. And it's a very
Yeah.
distorted form of urban development. In Kerala, what they did, which was very wise, was to separate the political capital, which is Thiruvananthapuram, from the economic capital, which is Kochi. And also you have, Kannur and Calicut and so on.
Mhm.
In Tamil Nadu, you have, Madurai. If you travel to Tamil Nadu, you'll see, Madurai, Coimbatore, Salem, Erode, Tirunelveli. To see actually, and if you that's one of the reasons Tamil Nadu and Kerala perform so well on social indicators. So I think that's, and particularly Tamil Nadu. Kerala of course has other issues and
Yeah.
large scale out migration. So I think that is Patrick Geddes said. Even to live in, from an ecological footprint point of view, smaller cities are more wholesome, more sustainable than larger cities. But even from the point of view of living, in a small city, you can walk to work, or you can take a 10-minute commute to work. You can get to know your neighbors. You can have a sense of community. In a large megalopolis, you're anonymous. But somehow, not just in India. I mean, if you look at Latin American countries, where it's one massive city. It could be Lima, it could be Sao Paulo. It's bursting at the seams, 13, 14, 15 million people. And the whole model of development is increasingly centralized. It's one magnet that attracts everyone. So I think this is, and Patrick Eddy is really is a very interesting thinker in that regard, because he saw London from the perspective of Edinburgh, and he saw Edinburgh from the perspective of Dundee, and he showed an alternative.
Yeah. But you spoke about the mainstream media being hostile or downright indifferent to these issues till it hits the practitioners themselves, which is a very small elite. What is perplexing to me is that there is no one actually untouched by the environmental crisis, right? When there is a cloud burst in Uttarakhand, when there is a landslide in Wayanad, it doesn't leave anybody. It's an across class. Of course, the lower income groups are worst hit, but there is no one who is untouched. Delhi, the AQI, this is the seat of government. Even the judges of the Supreme Court and the Prime Minister are not untouched by the air. Why do we not care? Why is there an absence of passionate anger over issues of the environment?
I think it's partly allegiance to an archaic, antiquated economic ideology, which is imitative development, catch up with the West, exceed the West, fetishization of GDP and economic growth without looking at quality of life and human happiness. So I think all these issues, I mean, if you actually try and integrate environmental sustainability into our development goals, but that's not really done. It's really one metric, which is GDP. No, so but I say I'm depressed but not despairing, because the younger generation today is much more alert and aware of these questions. And they're particularly alert and aware about climate change. And what my book is trying to suggest is environmental sustainability is more than climate change. Climate change makes it worse. Like you talked about Wayanad and the Himalaya.
Yeah.
Now, a cloudburst in the Himalaya or Wayanad will be particularly savage in its effects, because you've already ravaged the forest, depleted the soil, built roads without concern for geological factors and so on. And then you have these unexpected climatic events like a forest fire or a cyclone or a cloudburst. So, but even if climate change did not exist, we'd be in a really troubled place. And climate change, the sheer unpredictability, makes it much worse. And as you said, no one can escape it. So you think that if there was a flood, a localized flood in the Himalaya 40 or 50 years ago, the villages would be affected. But now it's the affluent pilgrim who's taken a helicopter to go to Kazan from Dehradun, and they'll be caught there, right? As has happened several times in 2014, for example, when you had that Kedarnath flood. So I think, or in Wayanad, it'd be the resort owners who also. So I think these are things that. One last thing I'd say, Barkha, when the Chipko movement started in the 70s and 80s, and when I was cutting my teeth as an environmental scholar, it was really activists and writers, and some pioneering journalists too, who were writing about these issues. Today we have, because of 40 years of thinking, we have a very vast pool of scientific expertise. So in our institutes of science, in our IITs, in other organizations, more focused research organizations looking at ecology, climate change, forest, soil, India now has a great, a bench strength of outstanding ecological experts who can tell you about air pollution, about water, about soil, about biodiversity, about urban planning, about transport. And the tragedy is that these high-quality scientific experts who can help the governments, state and central governments, design better, more caring, more inclusive, more sustainable policies, are never consulted by the political class. I mean, Indian Institute in Bangalore. Now, the Indian Institute of Science is India's leading scientific institute. It's in Bangalore. And we have experts who work on urban energy, transportation, biodiversity, forests, pollution abatement. And I doubt that any government in Vidhan Sabha, Congress or BJP or JDS has ever consulted them. And
absolutely, that's
20% of the fault is that of the scientists, because scientists work in isolation. They do their
silos,
their papers. But 80% of the fault is the politicians who haven't even approached them.
Absolutely. But in the end, Ram, let me ask you this. It is part of the problem that the conversation is always framed in these kind of banal polarities. So, one of the captions that I hate and I was mindful of not using it as shorthand in my program or in this conversation. Development versus environment. This banal binary, and this posits or frames the conversation, and then people actually think they have to choose this or this.
Absolutely.
Whereas that's not the point.
That's very well put. And it's not just banal, it's pernicious, misleading, dangerous. Because if anything that the recent events teach us is the only way to grow and prosper is through responsible environmental strategies. So it is, and the thinkers in this book, as I said, none of them glorify poverty. They wanted every Indian to have a dignified life, to have gainful employment, to have access to education and healthcare for themselves and their children, to even have a creative life outside work, through culture and so on, if you read Patrick Geddes' writings. But they knew that because India has such high population densities, because tropical ecologies are so fragile, and finally, because unlike America and Europe, when India became independent, it had no new worlds to conquer, no colonies to usurp and exploit and expropriate. It had to live within its means and design, blend environment and development. And I think that's really, you're absolutely right. That is a banal, misleading, pernicious, false dichotomy that is sometimes offered out of ignorance and sometimes out of malevolence to paint critics of centralized, exploitative, brutal development as anti-development.
Yeah. So before we let you go, on that point, you've called the Char Dham Highway a kind of disaster project, right?
Yes.
Roads for long in all countries historically have been a kind of benchmark of prosperity. And you say that the thinkers in your book never glorified poverty. The challenge is to find environmentally sound, people-friendly, bottom-up economic models of development. Where does a big highway project fit in with that thinking?
So a highway between, firstly, even in the plains, so between, say, Bangalore and Chennai, okay, a highway is, you can see the need for a highway, but even there, a better train system would probably take the load off the highway and be environmentally more prudent. But in a fragile ecology like the Himalaya, to have a 4-lane highway, even General Rawat, the late Chief of Army Staff, who came from Uttarakhand, said we don't need it. He said the Sipai can walk, and if you see the pictures in the Supreme Court appointed expert committee report headed by Dr. Ravi Chopra, it's horrific what the Char Dham highway has already done, And so I think in a fragile, the Himalaya are the source of our water, our culture and everything. And if you ravage the Himalaya like this, which is completely mistaken. One last point I'll make. And my friend, the great Uttarakhandi historian, which is linked to the Himalaya, Shekhar Pathak often says, we should make tourism like pilgrimage. Instead of which we're making pilgrimage like tourism. So
that's a great line.
Yeah. It's a beautiful line. When you're going to, when you're seeking spiritual solace, when you want to go to a place that is sacred, you should, not everyone can be like a Sabrimala pilgrim walking, but at least go gently. Don't go there quickly, take a selfie, go in a helicopter, in a fleet of Mercedes-Benz and want a highway for that. So that is, culturally, what we're doing is making pilgrimage like tourism, whereas it should be the other way around.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. And we have models. Bhutan has very carefully opened its doors. There are models even in the neighborhood. Thank you. A fascinating read, Ram Guha. Always a pleasure. Thank you, and talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.